Hello interwebs, I hope you are doing well, because it is time to finally talk about a Star Trek novel that I have been very excited about and anticipating, Star Trek Coda, Book 1, Moments Asunder by Dayton Ward. To be honest with you, I have been very much anticipating this book, not only because it is an epic trilogy that's a big crossover between all the different Star Trek books and storylines and, events that have been going on for the past decade or so, but also because it is doing what Star Wars never got for its expanded universe. It's giving an end to the stories and threads that the expanded universe has been building ever since it started after Star Trek Nemesis and the end of Star Trek Enterprise in the early 2000s, when we had that sort of big gap of time where there was no new Star Trek content coming out. For those of you who don't know, after Star Trek Nemesis and Star Trek Enterprise ended, and even during the J.J. Abrams timeline where he sort of had these, Kelvin-verse movies, which was in its own timeline, we never really knew if we were going to get more content set in the main Star Trek continuity that we'd all come to know and love with Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and even the original series. And we didn't actually get it back on screen until Star Trek Discovery came in just a few years ago. So between that time, a lot of the authors in the Star Trek novel verse actually kind of had free reign to write and do whatever they wanted, and they took full advantage of that. There were some really excellent storylines and lines of books that followed the crews of Deep Space Nine, the Voyager crew, the Next Generation crew, after their sort of end storylines on screen, and developed their own whole thing. Like Picard got his son, he married Beverly. Deep Space Nine, we saw Ezri Dax get her own captain chair on the Aventine. We even saw Sisko come back and get his own ship, the Robinson, as well. Deep Space Nine itself blew up in these books, things like that. There was some really big stuff that they did with these book series, and they even introduced their own sort of storylines and things like that. We got to see the politics of the Federation and got to learn more about like the presidency and President Baco and things like that. So there was a whole universe of Star Trek stories that were told in this sort of post-Nemesis timeline just in the books. And honestly, for me personally, it was the timeline that I truly loved and adored. I honestly got into Star Trek right as Star Trek Enterprise was canceled. I started watching in season 3 of Enterprise, and it was only canceled 2 years later. So the Star Trek that I had for a very long time, that I actually really invested and got into, was the Star Trek novel verse. It was the stories that I got to see continue these characters that I had come to know and love for quite a long time. And so with Star Trek as a franchise now telling its own canon, especially with Star Trek Picard sort of setting things after Nemesis and sort of kind of doing something completely different than what the novels eventually did. Picard doesn't have a son in those universe. He's not married to Beverly. Things with Data coming back in the novels and things like that obviously didn't happen in the Picard timeline. So there was no real way for these expanded universe books to get fit in with the timeline of Star Trek going forward, which had many fans of myself, fans of the literary expanded Star Trek universe, to worry that, are they just going to blow up the expanded universe, sort of ignore it, just say it never really happened, kind of similar to what we saw with the Star Wars expanded universe. Like the Star Wars expanded universe books were so insanely beloved. You had things like Grand Admiral Thrawn and Mara Jade and characters like that in those series that Disney kind of just came in and said, we don't really care about this. We're just going to blow that up, and maybe we'll introduce some stuff here and there from those books, but all that stuff you cared about and invested in, the Yuzhong Vong, the New Jedi Order, all that stuff, we don't care. They're gone. We're just going to ignore them. And it rightfully pissed off a lot of fans who had invested so much in those stories. Now, I'm not someone who's so beholden to canon, who's like, you have to follow these things. I mean, I'm here to, try new things, give writers free reign to do what they want to do. So I'm not so tied to these books, but there is an element of me that was really in love with this, series of novels. It meant a lot to me, and I was really invested in them. So I was kind of worried about that. And what Star Trek Coda is a trilogy of books that the writers actually got a chance to do in order to wrap out all the storylines of the Star Trek Literary-verse and send it out with a really big bang that will presumably, I haven't read the last book in the series, but presumably we'll sort of get it in line, the timeline in line with the with the sort of concurrent, canon Star Trek universe. But at least we're getting some sort of wrapping out of those stories here. And so that's what this first book, Star Trek Coda, is doing. The whole conceit of this storyline is that there is some sort of alien presence that is going through different timelines, destroying them and blowing them up. And we have Wesley Crusher at the beginning of the novel, who has the Traveler powers, beginning to get to be aware of this problem in that there's sort of this big temporal issue going on. So obviously we have some sort of timey-wimey sort of thing going on here that presumably will reset the timeline down the road. But what I love this book for, and this first book mainly focuses on the crew of the USS Enterprise E and the characters that we come to know in this timeline, like Teresa Chen, Tarek, who is a character in canon, but sort of had his own storyline within these novels, and a few other things, and Picard and Beverly and their son Renee, sort of focusing on them dealing with this problem, Wesley Crusher coming in and saying like, hey, all this stuff is going on right now, and we need to try and deal with it, figure out this mystery, who is destroying all these timelines. And what I'm really loving this novel for, first and foremost, is there's a lot of effort spent on, like I said, wrapping out the character arcs for all these characters that we came to know and love. Like, for example, we have Teresa Chen, who is a character who was introduced in the novels initially more as like a character who like didn't know what she wanted, she didn't have a place, she was a first contact specialist. So we get storylines of her sort of being like, oh, I might get to move on and in my career, get to move on in these moments of my life. We also get scenes with Ezri Dax in this book, where she gets to have moments of like, yeah, she's fully come into her own as a captain, which was her whole arc in this sort of novel verse. And so the novel is really doing a great job of focusing in on the characters that we've come to know and love and completing their arcs in satisfying ways because, well, more than likely we may not even see them again, especially characters that are exclusive to the novelverse, like I said, Teresa Chen, or versions of these characters that we won't get to see again, like Ezri Dax, or even the versions of Jean-Luc Picard here, who is a parent in this novel. Like the Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek Picard in the canon verse, in Alpha Canon, is not a father. And so this book really hones in on what it means for this version of Picard to be a father, what it means for him to be a parent, and really sort of is wrapping out that arc because we won't get to see it again in his relationship with Beverly. And I'm really loving this book for sort of giving us conclusions to those character arcs because we won't be able to get to return to them. Even further, though, what I also love about this book is because it is the final book in, or one of the final books in sort of the wrapping out of this sort of timeline, is it goes balls to the wall crazy. Like the writers can go and do whatever they want. They don't have to worry about beloved characters not dying and things like that because there's nothing after this. They can do whatever they want. So characters that we've come to know and love, that we think might be unassailable, have to be in the book series, cannot die, they may die here. And it's pretty ballsy. Like, there's a few moments in this book where I was absolutely shocked and dumbfounded that I was like, whew, they killed that character in really hard ways. And the book never, like, just does it for just shock value. Like, any character that dies, the book lets you have moments to feel the weight of that character's death because we have come to invest in them for decades now, or for at least over 10 years at this point, and they're characters that we came to know and love. And so it's not just done offhandedly, and yet the book isn't precious with them either. And I really appreciate this for that. The other thing, too, I will say about this book series is that the main plot of it, at least so far as we get into it, like there's still some more mystery going on here, but the sort of big mystery around the aliens that are destroying timelines and things like that, it is a little bit sad for this book because clearly these books were written before this was, or at least were being thought of and planned and written before this came out. But there is a little bit of a mild spoilers here. Similarities, not exactly the same, but some similarities to what Loki, the MCU show, did on Disney+. So there's some sort of similarities in terms of concept to that. And it's a little bit sad that these book series, which are probably clearly being written, completely ignorant of that story being made, that they're sort of going to be compared to that because they came out so relatively close to each other. And obviously Loki's sort of the big thing and also came out first. So a bit sad there on that front, but that's not the book's fault. But it is a cool mystery nonetheless, and I do love the timey-wimey stuff going on here. So that's one thing to note with the plot. And I do love the unfolding of the mystery here. I think they tie in some really cool ideas and concepts. It's not just sort of this idea of like, ooh, big alien coming in to destroy everything, so we have this big event. There is an element of that, but it's not sort of a Deus Ex Machina, we're going to blow up the universe sort of thing. There is a little bit of seeding that has been done and things that they're drawing from Star Trek history in order to build this mystery instead of it just being, and random thing comes into the universe to blow stuff up. So I did at least appreciate that element of it. The one negative that I will say with this book, and to be fair, it's only really something that I'm hoping more. It's not really a negative with this book, but it's more a hope for future books in the rest of this trilogy, the next two, is like I said, this book is very much siloed and focused on the Enterprise E crew members, as opposed to the rest of the expanded universe timeline. And while I presume each book in this trilogy will focus in on, like the next book will focus on the the Deep Space Nine crew that has developed in this timeline, and the next book will be maybe the Titan crew or things like that. I hope that they aren't as siloed as they won't be, because I would like to see these sort of timeline people sort of get interacting with each other in this trilogy one last time, because that was always the wonderful thing about the expanded universe timeline, is that these characters weren't necessarily focused to be siloed like we saw them on TV. Like Deep Space Nine crew members could interact with Next Generation crew members, vice versa, and Voyager crew members could interact with Deep Space Nine crew members too. And while we get a little bit of that in this book, there's not a ton of it. So while I hope that we do get more completed arcs throughout the rest of this trilogy, I also hope we get to have a little bit more of that little bit of fun with characters interacting with other characters that they normally wouldn't have on television, because that was one of the joyous things about this trilogy. So while I like this book quite a bit, there is certainly some promise still for the next two books that I'm really hoping that they get to deliver on one last time with this expanded universe of Star Trek novels. On the whole, though, I really have to say Star Trek Coda Book 1, Moments Asunder, was really wonderful, a lot of fun. They're really, really going for it and just having a really, really great time, and it makes me very excited for the last two books in the series. And yet also, as I was reading it, like I said, I just had this feeling of melancholy and sadness reading it too, because while I do like the new Star Trek shows, I like Star Trek Discovery, love Lower Decks, I have issues here and there with Picard, but overall I'm positive on it and hopeful for its future and what it's going to do with the Star Trek world. This, like I said, this expanded universe of Star Trek books was what I had for a very long time. These were the things that I had that got to expand the Star Trek universe for me. They were my recurring Star Trek things, and honestly were the big releases that I was able to get excited for as a kid, because I came into Star Trek at the end of its sort of that iteration of what it was, and so the only big releases that I got to be pumped for were these novels, which is why I love them so much. And so there's a bit of sadness in my heart to sort of see this version of the Star Trek universe come to an end, because it was something that meant a lot to me. But as they say, all things come to an end, and to steal that phrase from Star Trek, or in Star Trek stole it from elsewhere, but all good things must come to an end, and infinite diversity and infinite combinations, as they also say. So I am very excited to see how this wraps out, even if it makes me a little bit melancholic in the end. But what did you think of the Star Trek Coda Book 1, Moments Asunder? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Are you excited for the rest of the trilogy? Let me know. But beyond that, I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy.